Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to begin the panelist speech. First speaker is Professor Hiroshi Kito from Sophia University, and his presentation is on international migration policy of 21st century, a proposition from a historical perspective. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Historical population studies, that's the area of my expertise. In other words, I study about the population and demography, historical demography, and the change in birth rate, and so on. That's been the area of my research. So now I'm supposed to shed light on the future, and that is not exactly my expertise. However, I can connect the research or study on population with the international migration trends and how they change. So on the inflow of foreign migrants, related with this type of topic, I have been invited to give my comments and advice recently. So I have been contemplating on the issue of migration and perhaps from a different perspective from other experts. So I thought that is the area where I could possibly contribute. Now this shows major changes, transformation. This was done by a French researcher, and on the right bottom, you see from 1830 to 1914. This is the 19th century, when the UK was at the prime in terms of economic supremacy. At that time, that's how the population changed, and also migration shown. And if you compare that with more recent, that is the bigger chart, you see a big change. As for Japan, if you see right bottom, Japan is almost non-existent both in inflow and outflow of migration. But more in modern era, from the early age of Showa era, Japan was a country which was concentrating on sending out the immigrants, but during the colonial era, then there has been change, and also with the Asian economic boom, there has been change. But it's actually, Japan is unique in that sense, and Japan has been more of a sending country. And also, if you see these are the colonies migration, so this might be quite unique from other cases. But there has been major flow from the Korean Peninsula. We don't know if it's voluntary or involuntary, but in early 1940s, 2 million Korean people had arrived in Japan, according to the record. So we'd like to study more about the historical perspective, but let's look at more recent era, from 1980s to 90s. Japanese, the productive population or labor population had started to decline. At that time, then Japan entered into the bubble era, the economic boom, and was quite ready to make a major turnaround in terms of shifting to receiving more migration into Japan. So this is December 2012 by Ministry of Justice. This statistics shows that what is the status of the foreign nationals and what qualifications did these foreign nationals have when they came to Japan? And of course, there are permanent residents, special permanent residents, and also the dependents. And so 300,000 people, that's the people who requested for their family members to follow them to Japan, and students, and some business, and administration, and the skills, and working holidays also included in the some special activities. So these are the status that are related one way or another with labor, with work. So when it comes to art, it's almost nil. It does exist, but it's so inconspicuous. When it comes to the rationale behind coming to Japan, migrating to Japan is concerned, as you can see, the left half, those are the major rationales. From 1980s onwards, in Japan, there has been an advent or emergence of multiculturalism. And then the coinciding with that timing was the expectation towards foreign workers. So before the major earthquake and also recession, there's been a decline in the number of foreigners in Japan. But in the future, if we look into the future through EPA, economic partnership agreements, and TPPs, and these are the international alliances, then when these are going to become more and more active, then we can expect the accompanying international mobility and facilitation of international mobility of skilled workers. And also, the total population has been on the decline. And from 1990s, the productive population has gone down, and also the primary industry is in shortage of labor. So these elements indicate that there's much expectation towards filling these vacancies by the foreign workers. And when there's a Ministry of Health and Foreign Affairs symposiums, I sometimes participate as a panelist or as an audience, and usually the central debate is over pros and cons as to accepting more foreign workers. And pros would say that yes, we should accept more foreign workers, then this is how much benefits an economic outcome. How the opposite would say that there's going to be a lot of negative repercussions, including crimes and instability, etc. So there's always been this kind of a confrontation between the pros and cons over the acceptance of foreign workers. And I have participated in those symposiums where they had been debating. And now, when it comes to the pro acceptance of international workers, well, actually there was this was an international workshop which was based on more or less more favorable view towards the acceptance. I attended several of those, and one of them was sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also my university, Sophia University, and others as written here. So this was the International Workshop on Acceptance of Foreign Nationals and their integration into Japan. So the major thrust of this workshop was to strike a balance between pros and cons. And so those in the academia and labor unions and the business associations, so these stakeholders took part, and IOM and in the Shinjuku, that's where there is the highest concentration of the foreigners living there. So all these interest parties and stakeholders gathered in the workshop to discuss about this common issue. And Japanese society, grand design need to be developed to show directioning for the Japanese society. And on that, and also we should be more accommodating of these foreign workers. So there was a consensus there. And also, not just accepting foreigners, but Japanese labor, Japanese workers per se must change. And especially when they come to accept the skilled, highly skilled foreign workers, we need a more comprehensive framework. So on this type of view, there were those who were in accord, as well as those who are a little bit more conservative. At any rate, as for non-skilled workers and also social integration and the migration, coupling, globalization, on these issues, there has been different views expressed. But when it comes to highly skilled workers, there's been more view expressed as to the need for being more aggressive in accepting them. That is for the highly skilled workers. And so if you look at the website, and then you can read what was discussed at this international workshop. And this was a site by the Foreign Ministry. And it took about 6 months to make this homepage, because it must have been very difficult to write it down, the conclusion. Another one is NPO. This is by NPO Research Institute, and there is this the Migration or Immigration Policy Research Institute, and Mr. Sakanada was the head of this Migration into Japan Institute, and so Japan-style migration policies should be devised. So Japan model should be devised. So this is what was instigated, and actually this is well aligned with today's topic of this seminar. In other words, the need for developing effective migration or immigration policies was emphasized, so that the appropriate acceptance can be made. Not simply just to accept them as labor, but rather nurture the capable labor. That's the most important concept. So it's like Japanese higher education or the vocational institutions can be leveraged to nurture foreigners to become competent working members of the Japanese society. So this is very important. So in that context, support their recruit and so on. And actually, we should go for the target of creating the multicultural society or nation. And this was also mentioned, but again, this is a quite delicate matter. Japan, of course, since 1990s or so, had introduced by the government the so-called the long-term settlement, and but this was based on the blood relationship, and again there was an argument against that, because artistically and culturally Japan is so rich, and that is owing to the introduction of diverse cultures, and so we should consider this. And now I'm sidetracked, but the reason I mentioned that is because I am a researcher of estimating the past population, so demographics. So here, this is Japanese archipelago. This is shows the transition of the Japanese population. So you see that during the Jomon era went up, and then from Yayoi Nara, different eras slowed down. and then from Kamakura era, it went up, and then Kamakura went down. So from the 15th century or so, Japan's population started to pick up. Again, at the beginning of Edo era, that is 17th century, there was a big peak. And then 18th century went down. And towards the end of 18th century, during the Tenmei crisis, the population went down, the Tenmei famine. And then after that, it went up towards the end of the Shogun era. And so it's been going up and down. It's been fluctuating. And so that is the transition of Japanese population.
And in fact, the waves in Japanese population growth mostly coincided with the major changes in the Japanese society. And the population also changed with the major change in how people lived. And this is the very simplified comparison of civilizations during the Jomon period. People were living the hunter-gatherer lives. They were heavily influenced by the nature. And then the agricultural age, the rice growing started. And with the development of the governance and the government, and which lasted Nara and Heian period, and the population increased. And then the population declined once, but the market economy gradually was developed in Japan with the introduction of agricultural skills from the China. Population then increased again. But Japan was not open to the outside world. There was no way for Japan to import fuels and other food. So up till 19th century, the population stagnated. And then with the opening up of the Japanese society, with the start of the trade and the imports of the fuels such as coals, then also the development of the agriculture, the population also started to grow. So the civilizations and the change of people's lives and the population also fluctuated almost in parallel. But I hope you have time later on to look through the schematics in detail. With the change of civilizations and with the change of how people lived, and the accompanying changes didn't occur automatically, because those changes occurred because of how the people contacted with the outside world and how things and ideas were flowing. And according to the studies of the human genome, we can tell how people and ethnic groups were distributed. And also the DNA analysis of the old bones show that the people came from the south and also north of the Asian continent into Japan. So that was how the Jomon people appeared in Japan. And with the start of the agriculture and rice growing, well, people believe that the people coming from the other countries outside of Japan was rather limited in number. But in fact, they represented quite a large population, not predominant, but not the negligible, small either. And the people with rice growing skills, they arrived in Japan. They helped contributing to the building new civilizations. So from the Korean Peninsula and from China, mostly people came to Japan. And they helped establish a state in Japan. And at the end of the Muromachi era until the start of the Edo period, population increased again. At that time, the so-called the traditional lifestyles and arts and food and the dwellings, they were being established. And also from China, from the Korean Peninsula, and also in the 15th and the 16th century, even from Europe, the goods and ideas they started to arrive in Japan, which also changed the civilization, well, the greatly shaped the how the civilizations were formed at the time. And Hideyoshi, the Toyotomi, launched a campaign, the armed campaign in the Korean Peninsula, which was also controversial, and it is even controversial. But with that, the pottery makers and other artisans also came to Japan, or some of them were brought to Japan. The number may have been limited, but it also represented a major contact at the people's level. And at the end of the Edo period, and with the start of the Meiji Restoration, industrialization started in Japan with the introduction of the industrial skills, technologies, and also various institutions from Europe. The Japan changed significantly, which also has a linkage with the colonization of Asian countries. But it was again representing major contact, the exchange economically with other parts of the world. So population grew with the increasing contact with outside the people from outside world and the people of outside civilizations. And Kyoto University's researcher drew this model applicable to Southeast Asia. At the top of this cone, you see the contact with the neighboring regions, and then the civilizations and the various institutions were formed. So anyway, this shows that Japanese cultures and Japanese the civilizations were not purely homogeneously developed and framed only by the Japanese. Instead, Japan was constantly taking into themselves the ideas and the cultures and the religions and the many other things. If we are to gain something from the past, how should we build the future? With the start of the Meiji period, we tried to modernize Japan, but the population began to decline, particularly when the peak time was quite clear in the demographic the statistics. And the decline of the population was is true to many other advanced nations. Even China today is observing the beginning of the decline of the productive age population, according to the government statistics. And also in Southeast Asia, such a decline haven't started, but in Thailand, I have learned recently that the minimum wage needed to be raised nationwide. That means that they are now seeing the sign of the labor shortage. And 2025 in China, and also sometime later in Southeast Asia, United Nations say that the population will start to decline. So this is not unique to Japan. In the from the middle of the 21st century, perhaps with the only exception of the African countries and North America and Oceania, which they encourage inflow of the migration, most of the parts of the world will begin to see that their populations will start to decline with the growing affluence. Then, as a next step, of course, it's different whether the economy will grow or not. But perhaps the society must need to change by changing how the countries contact and exchange with other countries. Perhaps the opening up more the immigration policies reform might be inevitable. And as a way of conclusion, I'd say these are the following points. As was said already in the morning, of course, it's best that if we can raise the birth rate, but practically speaking, that would take the 30 or 40 years. During that period of time, the population will continue to decline. And even though the total fertility rate is the same as the replacement rate, so during this 21st century, the decline of the Japanese population will continue. This is inevitable. So this will make the Japanese society more inevitable, and the sustainability of the society itself is at risk. So that is why it is inevitable to have more foreigners coming and living in Japan. So accepting the immigration from outside is not simply to replace the working age population. That would be helpful to change Japanese society as well. This, I believe, is of particular importance. East and South Asian nations have already or will soon to see the decline of the working age population, so they might not be willing to come to Japan in a large number. So in order to make Japan more attractive for people to come as migrants, we need to be more receptive at the individual level and the institutional level, and some of the migration integration policy of Japanese characteristics will be necessary as a policy. In the 18th century, so-called kyosei, or living together in a multicultural population, is a buzzword in Japan. But how can we link that effectively with the migration and the migration policies? I believe that we can have some directions in that the issue in the panel discussion sessions that will ensue later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kito.